My name is Rose Jansen, and I'm from the Academy of Science St. Louis, and I'm going to take just a couple minutes to tell you a little bit about who we are and a little bit about this series and another that we do with the St. Louis Zoo. We're very pleased to partner with the zoo to bring you tonight's conservation conversation. We're also very pleased to partner with the zoo on a long-running and popular science seminar series that covers current topics in science. Those that are held here as well in the Living World Auditorium on Wednesday evenings. There are some brochures outside on the visitors desk, and so if you haven't already, feel free to pick one up before you leave tonight. Many of you are Academy members and friends, and again, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, I'm going to tell you a little bit about who we are, and then I'll let Zoo Education Director Louise Bradshaw introduce tonight's speaker. And then also I'd like to mention that next week, Wednesday, 7:30 p.m. in the zoo's River Camp, we have Hal Harris, who is a 2010 Academy of Science Outstanding St. Louis Scientist Educator Award recipient and Associate Professor of Chemistry and Education at the University of Missouri St. Louis, who will lead a science cafe on irrational scientific ideas, exploring what we think we know about science. So you'll have an opportunity to engage in conversation about scientific topics, where the public discourse doesn't always resemble the science itself, and that often leads to some unwise choices and investments of public and private resources. So issues like buying bottled water and whether or not the health food we believe we're purchasing is really health food. I don't know if you've ever been to a science cafe, but they're a lot of fun. You'll sit at tables. We'll have some refreshments there, lemonade and water and coffee, I believe, and you get to really kind of engage in a discussion about some of the issues that are brought up. Please make certain that you enter the zoo that evening through the south entrance and park in the zoo's south lot for that event. The north lot will not be open. And again, that's next Wednesday evening, 7:30 p.m. at River Camp. And then we are, the Academy, is a local nonprofit. We've been serving the St. Louis community for a very long time, since 1856. We have a long-standing mission to advance the public understanding of science and inspire the next generation of scientists and science advocates. So we continue to celebrate more than 150 years of community service by offering a very broad range of free and low-cost public science programming, collaborative seminars, and trips and tours throughout the region. You can find more information on us on our website at academyofscience.stl.org, or again by picking up some of the literature that's just outside the auditorium at the visitors desk on your way out. If you'd like to receive e-notification of upcoming Academy and St. Louis Zoo public lectures and events, we'll have some e-news sign-up sheets that'll make their way around the audience tonight. We'll have stickers as well that we can initial for any students who need to verify their attendance here, and those will be available also at the visitors desk after tonight's lecture. So with that said, I'll let Louise tell us a little bit about tonight's speaker, Michael Macek, who is the zoo's Curator of Birds.
Thanks, Rose. And before I introduce Mike, I also want to make sure you recognize we have additional speakers in this conservation conversation series. The next one will be on November 23rd. The title of that talk is Creepy Crawly Conservation. And the speaker for that is one of our partners in conservation, Jennifer Hopwood. She's the Midwest Pollinator Outreach Coordinator for the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. She's going to be speaking about the status of pollinators here in the Midwest as well as globally, how they're valuable for us, and what some of the challenges they face are, and what some of the great solutions that people, including the St. Louis Zoo, organizations like the St. Louis Zoo and our very own entomology department are very involved in helping with. So that's on November 23rd. In January 18th, Jeff Ettling, our Curator of Herps and Aquatics, will be speaking about Armenian vipers. And in February, we'll have a presentation about chimpanzees with some colleagues from Washington University. And again, this information is all in the Science Seminar Series brochures that are out front, both the Science Seminar Series and the Conservation Conversations. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mike Macek. Mike is, Mike's just going to tell you all about himself, because I think As he says, he knows it's his favorite topic. Maybe second only to penguins.
That's not, I'll put this on. I know Louise is, can you hear that? Can you hear that all right? Still? Okay. Louise is sort of battling a cold, so I told her I can talk a little bit about myself, but I won't bore you too much with that. But just to give you a background, I've basically been in the zoo business for about 26 years. I started my career at the Brookfield Zoo in Chicago, working with primates, and then moved over to birds. I find birds much more interesting, believe it or not, than primates. No offense to you primates out there. But it's an incredibly diverse group of animals, over 9,000 species found in every continent, every habitat, and to me I find that very interesting because I have a very short attention span. So I find that much more interesting. So in any case, I've been here for 20 years. This is actually my 20th year. And I have a degree in zoology and chemistry and actually a master's in business administration. And I got that at a point in my career where I wasn't quite sure if the science thing was going to work out. But ultimately it was a pretty good decision because for the most part I'm sort of an administrator at a zoological institution. So I do a lot of managing of conservation programs, research programs, help with education programs, exhibit design, things like that. So that's come in handy. So today we're talking about the Center for Conservation of the Humboldt Penguin in Punta San Juan. And I want to start by prefacing this by saying that this isn't the only bird conservation program we have at the St. Louis Zoo. Let me start by saying the WildCare Institute is basically the conservation arm of the St. Louis Zoo. And it was formally put in place about 7 years ago. But of course, through history, the St. Louis Zoo has been working in we've had our fingers in all sorts of things. When our current director came in place, he asked us to sort of focus our attention so we can have a little bit more impact, and I think that was probably a very good idea. So the curators basically looked to where our strengths were, where our interests were, where we might have had a bit of history already, and focused our conservation efforts in those areas. So currently we have a project in Punta San Juan, and I'm going to obviously talk a lot more about that. We have a project working with horned guans, a critically endangered species of crassid, which is sort of a South American chicken kind of, very funky looking bird, and that's in Chiapas in Mexico. We also work with a variety of endangered bird species on the northern Marianas Islands, which is located close to Guam. And these species are all endangered because of introduced predator, primarily a brown tree snake. As its name implies, it lives in the trees. So what would you eat if you lived in the trees? And that's birds. So a lot of these birds are endangered. We also have other projects that I'm not intimately involved in, but we have a Galapagos avian health program that is partnered with Patty Parker, Dr. Patty Parker from the University of Missouri, and they're looking at avian health of Galapagos species. And some of the other centers, we actually have a Sahalo-Sahara Center, works with a number of different kinds of species in sub-Sahara Africa, and there's an ostrich project involved there, and I will be going to Niger in January to help them out with some of their ostrich things. And we do have some staff out in the audience, and I know the faces that I see, they've actually been to Punta San Juan, and some of them have been to some of the other places as well. So, the Center for Conservation of Humboldt Penguins in Punta San Juan. Why Humboldt Penguins? The St. Louis Zoo has a long history working with the species in captivity. We've had them here at the zoo since the 70s, I think like 1977, 76. So they've been in our collection for a long time. We've been active with them in the field as early as 2001, almost 10 years. And as I said, the WildCare Institute was established about 7 years ago. And we were opening the Penguin Puffin Coast at about the same time. So it sort of seemed a gimme to kind of kick off the opening of a new exhibit with a new conservation effort. And that's Humboldt Penguins. So I want to start off by telling you a little bit exactly where we are. So we're in Peru, obviously, there's South America, and forgive me, but I just feel like I have to say some of this because Americans apparently are very good at geography, but I'm sure you all know where this is. But there's Peru. And specifically, we're working near the area of Nazca, which is down here. So Punta San Juan is right down here. Here is Lima. And Nazca, you might have heard about the Nazca Lines. These are some very prehistoric lines that are drawn in the desert floor, and they were discovered in the 1950s, and it's just some amazing archaeological sites. But a lot of people know a little bit about Nazca. This is an area called Pisco. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later because there was a major earthquake there a number of years ago, about 4 years ago, and one of our main partners is located there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Pisco. And right near there is a place called Paracas, and remember that name too, because up until last December, it was the only marine park within the Peruvian protected area system, or sort of their natural parks, and we have some work there as well. And so the Humboldt penguins are basically, they're found in Chile and Peru. In fact, let me go back a little bit and I'll show you. So Humboldt penguins are found about the middle of Chile to just about here in Peru. They overlap a little bit with another species of penguin down here called the Magellanic penguin, but they have a relatively restricted range, just these two countries with a bulk of the population located here and a bulk, well, really a bulk located right where we are in Punta San Juan. So let me also just mention that a lot of people don't think about these areas as actually areas where you might find penguins. Of the 17 species of penguins, only 2 of them are truly sub-Antarctic, or Antarctic rather, the Adelie penguin and the emperor penguin, which was featured in the March of the Penguins. A majority of the species are actually what we call sub-Antarctic, or in fact temperate. This is what we would probably call a temperate species. They live on actually the desert coast of Peru, where daytime temperatures can get to be, 90, 100 degrees. It could be quite cool at night. It's kind of a typical kind of desert, really cool at night and quite hot during the day. So it's where some of the driest deserts of the world actually meet some of the coldest ocean currents, because you've got the Humboldt Current coming straight up the western coast of South America from Antarctica. So that's true of all penguins. Even the northernmost penguin is the Galapagos penguin. So it's found right here in the Galapagos Islands, just even with the equator. So, but again, the water's very cold though there. So wherever you might find penguins, might be hot on land, but they're always going to be associated with very cold marine systems. So again, we're going to be working down there. So this is actually the peninsula, Punta San Juan. So did San Juan actually show up? No, it didn't, but San Juan is there. And then Punta San Juan, as its name implies, punta, it's a point. So it's a peninsula. And all these different islands are filled with an incredible diversity of animals. And you might be able to see that do you see this line here? That is actually a wall. Can you see that line? There's a line there that actually is a wall. It's about almost a 2-mile wall that protects this peninsula. And I'll tell you why, in a little bit later, I'll tell you why that wall is there, who's responsible for maintaining it and its function. But the peninsula is kind of interesting because, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, about 50% of the entire Peruvian penguin population exists on this one site. And that's a little unique to be on a peninsula. Most aquatic birds will often form colonies on islands where it's a little bit safer. You're away from land predators, which is one of the main reasons why penguins no longer fly, because for the most part, they've evolved in the absence of land predators, so they didn't really have to fly. And this probably happened some 60 million years ago. So for those colonies that are located, and of course there are penguins on these little islands that are all over this area as well, but there are some major colonies right on the coast, and that's a little atypical, but the wall is part of that reason, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Punta San Juan, so why did we choose that site? Why is Punta San Juan so important? And primarily it's because of the things we have listed here. The continental shelf comes incredibly close to the coast and the Nazca Trench, which is right around this area, PSJ. So that basically means the birds don't have to go as far to feed, because the water is cooler there, as this graphic implies. And this kind of shows you what's going on. So you have a variety of currents and wind that results in an incredible upwelling of all of this oxygen. So these deep areas, so this is the continental shelf, drop off very quickly close to the current. Cold water maintains or retains a lot more oxygen. It's a lot more highly oxygenated. And so what happens, because of variety of current phenomenon, there's a lot of upwelling of this rich oxygenated water up into the shallower area where photosynthesis can take place, and you, as a result, you have a lot of phytoplankton and zooplankton that is kind of the base for everything. So all of the fish that the penguins feed on are eating all of this stuff, and the penguins aren't stupid. What this means is they basically don't have to go as far out to hunt. So the penguins and all the other animals, the cormorants and the pelicans and the sea lions and the fur seals, they've all chosen this point because it's really good real estate. I mean, it's location, 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 right? So this is a really good location to go shopping, to go grocery shopping. So that's why they're located there. And this map here basically shows you that this lighter pink area is where cold but not freezing cold water exists. And these are the most productive waters in the world. So that area around the equator, although beautiful and we love to go snorkeling and diving in it, it really isn't the most productive. These are the most productive waters. I don't know what the latitude and longitude are, but those are the most productive. And you can actually see how that kind of swings up right there. See that? And Punta San Juan is sort of right there. So because of that trench and because of the continental shelf coming so close, it actually affects the currents and brings them up a little bit higher on this side. So you find penguins on this side, where you have Brazil, and northern part of Argentina, you do not find penguins. You do find some Magellanic penguins down here, but nothing up here. So that's why it's so important. And that's why as I mentioned earlier, about 50% of the entire Peruvian population of Humboldt penguins live here. And that's why we chose this site to focus our work on. Because again, our director asked us, where can you go to have the greatest impact? And we felt with regards to Humboldt penguins, this is where we could have the greatest impact. So here's just an example of the different types of little animals and things that basically the prey items of the Humboldt penguins feed on. And the prey item is primarily anchoveta, or a type of anchovy, and sardines. So, and these are the same sorts of fish that a lot of the other birds, pelicans, again, cormorants, boobies, the fur seals and sea lions are also eating. So the one thing about Punta San Juan, again, because of this phenomenon, is just the incredible diversity. This is a relatively small area with literally hundreds of thousands of fur seals and sea lions and millions of guano cormorants. These are the guano cormorants, millions and millions of them. Nazca boobies and Inca terns, and these are brown pelicans. There's also huge populations of sea lions, sea otters, and of course lots of marine mammals, dolphins and orcas and whales, etc., all found in this area. So the penguins, let me tell you a little bit just about the Humboldt penguin. So the Humboldt penguins nest in a variety of ways. If you are familiar with the March of the Penguins, the Emperor Penguin, they actually balance the egg on their legs, on their feet rather, and there's a little flap that goes over their egg and they incubate it that way. King penguins do the same thing. Other penguins actually build nests just like other birds do. They use sticks and grass and they build nests. The Humboldt penguin is one of 4 species that's a burrower. So they actually dig a hole. They dig a hole in the substrate and lay their eggs, and you can see a female right in here, and she's got 2 eggs next to her. And this is the substrate that they burrow into, and that substrate is guano. And I'm going to talk a lot more about guano, believe it or not. You probably didn't think I'd be talking about guano. But what is guano? Guano is basically bird feces. It's bird poop. Wow. Bird poop. Oh, didn't happen again. Wow. Anyway, so why is that important? Because these are coastal areas, and if any of you have visited any coast other than, say, Florida, where there's a sandy beach, if you've gone to the northern Pacific coast of, say, Oregon or Seattle or California, that's very much like what the Peruvian coast is, very rocky, bedrock, essentially. But on top of all this bedrock is thousands, or used to be at least, thousands of years of accumulated guano. And it sounds kind of gross, but because this is such a dry desert area, it dries very quickly, and it's very much like soil. As you're approaching Punta San Juan, you can definitely smell it. There's a very much an ammonia smell as you're approaching Punta San Juan. But as you're walking on it, it's like clay. It's very hard. Whoop. Let me go back there. It's very hard. Well, it's hard to some degree. It's hard on the surface, but the birds can burrow into it. So the guano is important because it provides a nesting substrate for them. If you take away all that guano, all they have is the bedrock. And I'm going to talk more about that later, but remember that. The other thing about Humboldt penguins, like most penguins, they're relatively long-lived. In the wild, they can live anywhere between maybe 12 to 15 years. In captivity, these birds can live to be about 30. Their natural predators would be things like orcas and sea lions, maybe some fox on land, certainly sharks, things like that. Sea lion is probably the primary predator, but they have a relatively low reproductive rate. They're probably only going to breed about once a year. They generally will only have 2 eggs, of which maybe none or maybe one will actually reach maturity, and they'll take anywhere between 5 to 7 years to become sexually mature. So if they take that long to become sexually mature and they only live 12 to 15 years, you know, they're not going to replace themselves that many times in their lifespan. So these are some of just sort of the natural you know, ecology of or physiology of the penguins, but it is responsible for them, in fact, being threatened. And when you add all the sort of challenges that they're up against, these sorts of reproductive strategies kind of work against them. At the moment, there's about 33,000 birds located in both Chile and Peru. About 22,000 of those are located in Chile. About the balance, rather, is located in Peru, about 10,000. And of those, about half of those are located in Peru. So we're not focusing on the whole population. We're focusing on that one site in Peru. We had some colleagues from Milwaukee that were already working in Chile, so there was really no reason to kind of assist in Chile. They kind of had their act together a little bit more than Peru did. So we decided to offer our assistance to Peru. All right, so guano. I promised you that I'd talk more about guano, and I am going to. So what's the big hoo-ha about guano? Well, let me give you a little bit of history about guano and Peruvian culture. Traditionally, it goes back way before Inca times. And the guano, I mentioned that it has a very ammonia smell as you approach it. It's very high in nitrogen. And as a result, it makes a great fertilizer. And the Incas and the civilizations before them knew this, and they utilized it for their agriculture. And so the value of guano as a fertilizer was kind of rediscovered the second half of the 19th century. We were, in fact, one of the primary consumers of guano, as was Europe. And believe it or not, Peru, it was their major export, imagine, their major export. And in fact, they were such a guano-rich country that they paid no property taxes. They had free education, et cetera, because of all of the income that the export of guano brought. There was intense exploitation, however, of these guano reserves. And so they were really mining them to the bare bone. And in fact, at the beginning of the 19th century was really when some of the last significant deposits of guano were harvested. And I'm going to talk about the impact that had on the birds and the Peruvian economy, et cetera. But basically, also during the wars, World War I and World War II, a lot of synthetic or artificial fertilizers were being developed. So the United States kind of moved away from these natural fertilizers, moved into these synthetic fertilizers. What's going to be really interesting now, as we're sort of experiencing this another green movement, as we have at different parts of our history, it'll be interesting to see if some of these natural fertilizers kind of don't come back into our sort of scheme of agriculture, at least in a small way, whereas it has none at the moment. I can say, if some of you might be familiar with what's it called, Wild Birds Unlimited. Some of you may be familiar with them. They sell wild bird seed, and there's several stores in the St. Louis area. You can actually buy a little bag of guano right now from them, and it's actually from Peru. So it's kind of interesting that I've already seen like this little thing show up. But it'll be interesting to see how that kind of progresses, if at all. So in any case, so Peru was very rich in guano. It was overexploited, kind of crashed, and the foreign companies that were utilizing it moved on, but today it's still used for local farmers. So the government doesn't make much money on it, but it is used domestically still, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. So who produces the guano, however? It's not the penguins. The penguins are basically endangered as far as the Peruvians are concerned with regards to how they rate things status-wise. We list them as vulnerable, but the bottom line is they probably never were found in huge numbers. It's probably just one of those populations that were always sort of, maybe 30, 50,000, something like that. Nothing like some of the subantarctic species. But the main producers of guano are the boobies, the Guano cormorants, these are the main ones, and the brown pelicans. And this is all guano, and all of these little rings are basically nests that were made by the Guano cormorants. And if you go there during the breeding season, you'll see hundreds of thousands of Guano cormorants spaced perfectly all through the horizon. But at the end of breeding season, this is what you see, this sort of moonscape with all these little craters left there. And this is, again, is all guano, but that's probably just been deposited in the last 10 years. So in about 1909, the Peruvians did decide to kind of reestablish kind of their at least their domestic guano production. And they developed the Guano Administration Company, and that happened again around the turn of the century. So this did provide some protection to the guano birds, which as a result kind of also helped some of the other species that lived with them. But again, remember, the main objective to the government was to protect their guano birds, to protect their commodity. They wanted to protect the cormorants, the pelicans, and the boobies so that they would produce feces so that they could harvest it. This wasn't a conservation, move. This was basically a business move. So what they did is they created a series, they created a guano series, a Guaano System series, which actually is 33 particular locations that were sort of notorious for collecting guano. And each one of these areas had sort of some level of protection, whether it was in fact a wall or a guard, or they just made it sort of against the law to trespass in that area or to collect guano for yourself, etc. So a lot of islands and a few peninsulas. Punta San Juan was included in that guano system. And you could see these reserves. This is guano from down here to here. So, that's like an incredible, incredible resource there. But again, just taken down to the bone by the turn of the century. So there was, again, a little bit of protection that occurred because of the establishment of the system. And these are a variety of the species that actually sort of cohabitate with the guano birds. And you could see that there was some positive impact, even though it wasn't in a conservation effort. There was some positive impact for some of these species that were vulnerable or endangered. Things that stick out. This is the sea otter here. This is a fur seal, which is a very distinct species in South America. Of course, the Humboldt penguin is there. What else do we have? The Peruvian pelican is actually a separate species as well now. And they've determined a lot of these things recently through DNA work, whereas before they thought, oh, this is just the regular brown pelican. In fact, it's a distinct species. So again, a variety of species benefited from their efforts, and that was good. And I guess that's basically what I'm saying here. There was some benefit to all these species, and numbers did go up, as this graph shows. So around 1900, this just shows the guano birds, so the Guano cormorants primarily. These are millions of birds, so you could see when protection started, the numbers go up. On some sites on the mainland, when they started to put walls up, again, the numbers skyrocketed as well. So there was again, an obvious benefit of doing this. But there was also the downside of harvesting. So during all of this, the idea was that the Peruvian government was going to be harvesting at a variety of these sites. They had 33 to choose from. So basically on, I guess, what would be a 30-year rotation, but I think they actually probably collected from 2 or 3, probably 3 sites at a time. So maybe every 10 years, the plan was for them to be harvesting from a site. So they might harvest at Punta San Juan, then 10 years later, they'd harvest at Punta San Juan again, and et cetera. So they kind of had a management plan. The problem was their methods of harvesting were very detrimental to the population of animals that live there. So they would obviously shoot probably anything to eat. These are actually Andean condors that they shot. They ate the pelicans, the fur seals, really anything that had blood going through its veins they probably ate. These are primarily and historically mountain people that come down. This is sort of a cultural thing. Mountain people that come down from the Andes and actually do the harvesting. They're called guaneros. And so they would exploit these areas. Of course, there are disturbing nesting colonies walking through them, collecting eggs, destroying nesting sites as they're walking through them or shoveling areas, et cetera, and creating pollution and waste, et cetera, building their little shanties while they're collecting and then just walking away from it all. It's not like there's a cleanup or anything. So there was a credible benefit, but also a downside to the harvesting itself, or at least the method on how it was done. So so that's kind of one threat, and I'm going to try to address each one of these as we go. So obviously that's a problem. So one of the things that we and our partners, and I would say the WildCare Institute, the Center for Conservation of the Humboldt Penguin, and all the WildCare centers, our successes are based on our partnerships and our collaborations. So when I say we, I mean the St. Louis Zoo and our partners and our associates and our colleagues, Peruvian and American. So one of the things we thought would be quite beneficial would be to help the Peruvians with their assistance develop methods for sustainable harvest. So in 2001, the Humboldt Penguin SSP, and an SSP is a species survival plan. Within the zoos, we have an organization called the American Zoo, Association of, I always get it, what is it? American Association of Zoos and Aquariums, thank you. We've changed it a couple times. Within there's this organization that kind of oversees all of our captive populations, and a species survival plan basically oversees the captive population and all things, in this case, Humboldt penguin. So Peruvians actually approached the SSP, or the zoos in North America that hold Humboldt penguins, and said, they're going to harvest in Punta San Juan. We'd really like some assistance in how to develop a sustainable harvest. We'd like some Americans to come down and sort of serve as international observers. Whenever you're doing something like this, it always helps to bring in outsiders because they know they're sort of being watched. They know, that this is important because, people were brought from another place down here. So we helped do that, and this involved a variety of things, but most importantly, it involved basically designating sites beyond which the guaneros could not operate. So wherever the birds were located, there was something like a 50-foot to 100-foot sort of safe zone beyond which they couldn't pass. And in this slide, you can actually see, and I think the next one has some as well. Here, this is you could see the demarcation. So we went up several weeks before the harvest started, put up these streamers and these posts. So the penguins are on this side, and of course the ocean is over here, and the guaneros are over here. So they basically cannot go beyond that site. That has the greatest impact. And you could see, look at how they're harvesting that. I mean, you could see there's probably about 3 feet of guano here that they've taken down. When they get to this point, they actually get on their hands and knees and start scraping it with little paintbrushes. It's that valuable down to the bedrock. So you could see where if they did that over here, there would be no nesting sites left for those birds. So we've had staff go in 2001. There was another harvest in 2007. So you see already what happened here. It was supposed to be every 10 years. Now, in fact, it was just 6 years. And in fact, they're doing another one now, we've been told, next year. So this one was in 2007. Now, 4 years later, they're actually planning on doing yet another one. So they haven't really lived up to what they told us they were going to do, but nevertheless, if we can go there and protect those same sites, we'll be fine. But the interesting thing here, too, in 2007, we sort of took it another step in that we actually had the guaneros sign a little contract that said, what they would and would not do. We actually, through the Humboldt Penguin SSP, all the North American zoos, raised money to actually provide food for the guaneros. And So they did provide their own food in 2001, but it wasn't perfect. So in 2007, we were actually able to provide food for them when they came down, so they weren't killing anything. We, of course, had guards and observers there anyway, but nevertheless, it was sort of a nice gesture to say, hey, we want to help you this way. They also got a little certificate at the end of it that they were very proud of that said that they participated in the first documented sustainable guano harvest. And there were also education sort of components that the volunteers did. So the volunteers went to the guanero camps, and this is Rick Smith, one of our keepers, and actually educated the guaneros about why we were doing this, why it was important for them, for their country, and for their livelihoods to do this. So I thought that, and there were some outreach programs in the local community as well. And again, here you could see just them harvesting the guano. So another is both natural and introduced. So natural predators, I mentioned, would be things like sea lions, primarily orcas, sharks, etc. When they put up the walls to protect some of these sites, not only did some of the guano birds and the Humboldt penguin populations increased, but the natural predator populations increased as well. But they were sort of, in tandem with each other, so I suspect it didn't have too much of effect on it. But there's probably more predation now because of these guys as well, but there's a few more penguins as well. But we're more concerned about things like rats being introduced. This is actually a native fox, but one of the things the wall does is keep the fox out, as well as feral cats, feral dogs, because there is a mine close by, and with the mine comes people, and with the people comes domestic animals. And also people that actually come onto the nesting sites, and what they're due now, because of the wall, they'll often come from the seaside on small boats, and they're taking shellfish and things like that. Now, this doesn't have a great impact on the food source for the penguin, but it does disturb them greatly when they come into these shallow areas right adjacent to nesting sites, to basically just in wetsuits or in snorkels collecting a variety of shellfish and things. And most recently, something they've been doing is actually using dynamite in the shallows to kind of blow up everything that's there, including the fish and penguins and the corals and everything. So that's been quite a challenge. So I'm going to talk about some of the things we're trying to do to address that. So one thing is the wall. As I mentioned, this wall was put up by the official government guano company, and it's about 2 miles wide. It's a great idea. It works very well, and you could even see here, you could see the wall on that side of this particular cove. And it works quite well, but being a seawall, it obviously comes with a lot of damage, and it has to be kept up, and the government really hadn't been keeping it up. And so any of these little gaps and things are enough for, a dog to jump over, or a cat to jump over, or people to climb over, etc. So a number of zoos through the years, this is sort of something that probably happens every few years, a section of the wall has to be replaced. And that's what we've done, and a variety of other zoos have done to help support that. And this is a very tangible thing that you can show, your donors or your zoo friends that, hey, we helped, save this area by helping to maintain the wall. But probably most importantly is just having staff there. Having people there all the time. So in a consortium that we put together about 5 years ago with the Philadelphia Zoo, St. Louis Zoo, and the Brookfield Zoo, we are supporting 3 full-time staff that are located right on Punta San Juan. So we have 1 guard, so a person who basically patrols all of the coves on the site at night to make sure people aren't coming on the site to disturb the penguins, and looking out for feral dogs and cats, setting traps, things like that. And then we also have 2 biologists that are working there and assisting with the guano harvest, assisting with a health assessment that I'll talk about later, the census, a variety of things. And they're also on a daily basis, because they live there, they live right on the site. There's this little casa that sort of overlooks the coves there in Punta San Juan, and they're also taking and collecting a lot of sort of basic physiological and ecological data on this species things like molting patterns and egg fertility and hatching rates and surviving rates and things like that, tagging a lot of birds and tracking a lot of information. And they build a lot of these, like these little casitas that we call them, to sort of look over these variety of coves to observe the birds, et cetera. These are also used during the guano harvest. Another threat is artisanal fisheries. And artisanal fisheries basically just refer to sort of local fishermen. As I mentioned already, there are people that, collect a lot of shellfish in the shallows where they can dive or snorkel, et cetera. But there is a lot of fishing that occurs with nets, probably within a mile and a half of the coast. And this does, in fact, have a direct impact on penguins, in that obviously they can get tangled up in the nets. In this boat, you might not be able to see it, but there's dolphins in here. There's a baby sea lion. I think there's a penguin in here, and there's a turtle down here as well, a sea turtle. So they have incredible impact, direct impact on the animals. I also mentioned about using the dynamite. That has an impact on them. And these penguins were actually intentionally harvested for a fiesta. So although penguin meat, I can't imagine it tastes very good. It must be incredibly oily, but it's considered somewhat of a delicacy and something special that you might have during a fiesta. So they are still, and they are protected, mind you, by the Peruvian government, but it's pretty hard to enforce in some of these remote areas. So that still happens, but probably isn't a major threat. And one of the things I do want to say is our staff, there is a little port in Punta San Juan, and our staff does regularly visit the port and actually see what sort of things they're bringing off the boats. And even when they're in Punta San Juan, if the boats come within a mile of the coast, they do basically blow whistles and tell them to go away. They don't always do what you want them to do, but all the boats do have numbers on them, so they'll go to the port once a week and report the numbers to the Port Authority of all the boats that were within that 1 to 1.5 mile limit. A bigger threat is probably industrial fisheries. And that's a much harder problem to get a handle on. And what's happening here is that the main food source, primarily the anchovy and the sardines, are being harvested not to eat, but to be ground up into fish meal. And the fish meal is being used, ironically enough, for fish farming, but not in Peru. Again, we are unfortunately probably the primary consumer of this product, as well as Europe. And I often wondered when some of these safe cards came out. The Monterey Bay Aquarium came out with these safe seafood cards. You would often see like farmed fish on those lists, and I always thought, well, I wonder why the farmed fish aren't safe to eat. And there are a lot of byproducts that are produced in the process of raising the fish. That would be one downside, environmental downside of fish farming. But in this case, the impact is actually the food source. So these huge resources, these huge amounts of sardines and anchovy are being harvested in Peru, ground up into fish meal, shipped to the United States to raise salmon and things like that. And I can guarantee you that salmon is not being shipped back to Peru. And if it was, the Peruvians sure the heck couldn't afford to buy it anyway. So this is a huge potential protein resource for the Peruvians. And like any third world country, it's very difficult to regulate a lot of these things. So the fisheries here are really unregulated. And in fact, most of the major fishing companies are not even Peruvian. They're foreign. So there's very, very little benefit coming to the Peruvians for this kind of scale. And of course, when you're harvesting to such an extent, I should probably show you the next slide. When you're harvesting in such an extent, you are directly competing with the food source for the birds. So this graphic shows you that basically Peru is the second largest industrial fishery in the world next to China. And what they take in 1 year is equal to what about 160 other countries take. And most of that, believe it or not, I didn't have the little picture, is right by Punta San Juan. So you're really, at this point, competing directly with the penguins, because this is their major food source. And one of the main things we can do to tackle this is education. I mean, this is a big problem to get your hands around, but education is probably the biggest thing we can do. So with that, and I think this was in 2008, one of our primary partners, Patricia Maluf from the Cayetano Heredia University in Lima, she actually formed this NGO called the Center for Resource Sustainability, or Environmental Sustainability. And she basically, she's a Peruvian, and basically put together what was in 2008 the first week of the anchovy, or the week of the anchoveta, which was a great idea. So the objective here was basically to teach Peruvians that they can actually eat anchovies. I mean, it is a good local protein source. And, you know, you might think, well, you know, wouldn't they eat it? They know it's there anyway, wouldn't they eat it? But in fact, at the turn of the century, Peru was basically a starving third world country, and the president at that time introduced chicken to the Peruvian diet. So they never really ate chicken, and he introduced chicken to the diet, and now chicken is probably one of the most consumed proteins in Peru. But here is a natural resource, a natural protein they can eat, but they're not used to eating it. So Patricia went to some of the best restaurants in Peru, in Lima, and contacted, they sort of have their version of the Food Network, and got some of the best chefs in Lima and put together some of these wonderful dishes. You know, you could see there's some ceviche. This is called causa up here, which is a local dish made with potatoes and fish. A variety of presentations here. I'm not sure what this is. And obviously, this is a kind of sushi. So, you know, lots of things. And again, some famous chefs were, I don't know these people, but they apparently, I was guaranteed they were famous. So the famous Peruvian chefs. And they even had a luncheon at the White House, and this is the president, Alan Garcia, to kind of have a big public sort of event, a press event, to kind of kickstart this anchovy week. So, you know, that's really important, just to teach people that, hey, you can eat this and it's here, and why shouldn't you benefit from this incredible resource? So here's another even bigger problem, global warming. So the biggest effect of global warming is probably what most of you are aware of, El Nino. El Nino is something most of us have at least heard the word. El Nino refers to sort of this periodic warming of the waters. That's obviously a climatic phenomenon. And whether you believe that it's happened through the millennium or it's a man-made thing, there's no doubt that at least in recorded history, we know that they are happening at a much more frequent rate. So this shows sort of the results of probably what was the most severe recent El Nino in 1997, 1999. You could see the Peruvian populations of Humboldt penguins, you know, dropped better than half. Fur seals, you know, way down. Sea lions, the guano birds, you know, plummeting almost half. So great impact on them, again, because of food source. As the waters warm, that sort of phytoplankton and zooplankton phenomenon doesn't happen, and or the prey fish move out into deeper waters, and the birds, you know, either die of starvation, they have some poor recovery times as far as, you know, maybe the next year it could take, you know, 6, 7, 8, 10 years for them to recover because of some of the things I talked about, the fact that they only breed once a year, they only have 2 eggs, might only raise 1. They take 5 to 7 years to reproduce. So it can take a long time for those birds to recover from an event like that. Now what we're seeing is that since then there's been a number of El Ninos, not as severe as this one, but they're occurring much more frequently. So the impact might not be as dramatic, but it's there nevertheless, because we know they're happening a lot more frequently. That one, if anybody has any ideas, you can leave them on the way out. That's a big problem that I think we're all faced with. Pollution is another issue, like any place. This is actually the result of what I was talking about a little bit earlier. This is all the pollution being dumped straight out into the ocean from a fish meal plant. So obviously, you know, the ports are right along the coast. They bring the fish in, they process it right there, and all the waste goes right back into the ocean. This shows you just a little bit of the coast here, and what we're showing here is Punta San Juan right here. This little black thing indicates that there is in fact a fish meal plant in the area, and this color signifies sort of moderate pollution. So for this graph, it's not the worst place. There's some worse places around, but it's moderate, so it's kind of right there in the middle, and again, this is where most of the Peruvian penguins live. So another sort of future threat that we see developing is the exploration, exploitation of hydrocarbons, particularly natural gas. And again, we're down over here, so we're a little south of where a lot of this is going on. And you can see this is, what are the years here? 2003 to 2005. So, wait, is that right? What is that? Well, I can't see it now, but in any case, it kind of shows you from a period of, I think, about 3 years, the development that's occurring there. And this is occurring out in the ocean. So they're actually, finding the natural gas out here. There's a huge gas line that comes not so far from Punta San Juan. We know that there are leaks and things like that within the pipeline. We don't really know right now what effect that's going to have on the penguin populations, but we're looking into it. How am I doing on time? Good? How much time do I have? Lots of time? Okay, well, we're going to be good then. So anyway, so that's kind of a problem that we see sort of arising on the future. So with that, though, with, development of hydrocarbons, with, fish meal plants comes people. So again, where are we? There's San Juan down there. Nazca is here, so that's sort of like a little touristy area. A lot of people come to see those sites. But this area is all just kind of built up. You could see there's lots. This is desert. This looks like a moonscape. But people are finding livelihoods in all these little areas, and most of them are probably associated with copper mining, the fish meal plants, perhaps, guano harvesting and the hydrocarbon plants that are coming in. And they're also talking about bringing the Panamanian Highway further through and creating potentially a major port very close to Punta San Juan. The Panamanian Highway, I don't know if that's it right there, but it kind of ends like right before you get to Nazca, but there's been some talk about taking it all the way through. So for a lot of these sorts of problems, education, pollution, hydrocarbons, global warming, why you shouldn't eat sea turtles or penguins, the greatest impact we can have is through education. Education of all those people that are moving into that area or live there or make a livelihood out of it. So one of our main partners is a Peruvian NGO called Acorema, and they're basically a Peruvian marine ecosystem NGO. They originally were focusing on dolphins and sea turtles, and we sort of convinced them to add penguins. And now they have lots of wonderful outreach things that they do, but we sort of like to focus and support a few of their initiatives, one being their visitor center. And they have a lovely visitor center, or used to have a lovely visitor center in the area of Pisco. Remember I mentioned Pisco? And Pisco was where the big earthquake was. So Pisco was really close to the national park called Paracas. So up until recently, it was the only marine national park, and it was a very popular place for domestic tourists. So it was sort of like us going to Lake of the Ozarks. A lot of people from Lima would go to Paracas, and there were penguins there. And Paracas was only about, a half an hour, 45 minutes to Pisco. And in Pisco, they had their visitor center. So there was a fair number of tourists who would come down for other reasons. Pisco is also a liquor, I don't know if you knew that, but so they come down there for the liquor. They're sort of like, there's like wineries and things like that. So they come down to Pisco. And they have this really nice education center with a lot of really nice displays and, people on site. And again, most of their guests are, Peruvians from Lima and their surrounding areas. So it was wonderful. And then they had this catastrophic, almost 8.0 earthquake that really took Pisco out, and they've lost their center. So what we're helping them do now is actually raise money to rebuild the center. But the beauty of these people and the wonderful dedication is that they continue to do a lot of their programs even though they don't have their visitor center. So they're still doing a lot of research, research too, but a lot of outreach and things like that from wherever they happen to be staying now in Lima with relatives and wherever. They're still dedicated to their mission. So in fact, this shows sort of, this is a really exciting project here that we help support, and this is basically teaching the teachers. So this is a two-day class that was teaching local teachers about marine ecosystems and what they can teach their students in the local area about dolphins, penguins and sea turtles. Also, going to community centers and telling people that, penguins don't really make good pets, and they really don't. So I'm not sure what she was doing with this, but this was sort of a repatriation of a penguin that somebody came forward, and basically there was a little penguin amnesty program where they can come forward and give up their penguins. One of the other things we are doing is the census, and it's very important to keep track of population trends, and nobody else was really doing this. The Humboldt Penguin SSP was supporting this to some degree with the Brookfield Zoo, and so we joined in, and at this point we are actually doing the census with the help of, again, some of our Peruvian partners and occasionally some people from the Brookfield Zoo. But again, it's really important to track the populations through time to see how El Niños affect them, how maybe some catastrophic event like, a major earthquake or a tsunami or something like that might affect these populations. And we've had a variety of staff do that. This is basically, in a single census, will take about 6 weeks. And about 20 sites are visited along the Peruvian coast. So we're not just looking at Punta San Juan, we're actually looking at the whole Peruvian coast. Our colleagues from Milwaukee actually do the Chilean part of the census. So between the two of us, we're sort of covering both of the countries. And the population, for the most part, I'm happy to say, since 1999, has stayed relatively stable. There's been some dips. We had that big dip in '78 and '79 with the El Nino, and on El Nino years it might go down a little bit, but just a little bit, not like those big El Ninos. And other years it goes up. What we are seeing is that the populations do move around quite a bit. If there is a major disturbance in an area, and we get reports from local people about colonies being, maybe feral dogs were sighted in a colony for a period of 3 weeks or something, and the penguins just leave that area. They leave that area and they go colonize another area. So the population moves around, and as we're creating a network of partners, we're getting more information where we might visit someplace and say, God, there were 2,000 penguins here last year, what happened? And you go into town and a local tells you, oh, well, something like that happened. There were feral dogs there. My cousin was fishing up here and he said he saw a bunch in this cave further north, and we go there and lo and behold, you might find 1,000 penguins there where you didn't realize there were penguins there before. So they might have just been birds that moved around. So very important work. Another thing is a health assessment, and this is a sort of proactive project that we're working on, and we started it with Mike Atkinson, who is a veterinarian. He actually was here at the St. Louis Zoo for 3 years, and he helped us initiate this health assessment, looking at the birds, and he is now taking a full-time job at Brookfield, which is a nice kind of connection. We already had the connection with the Brookfield Zoo, and now he's there, so he's going to continue along with our staff. Jane Merkel's in the audience and Melissa Miller's in the audience, and they've participated in this before. They continue to carry that out. And this is very proactive because what we're doing is basically collecting baseline data on basically the physiology of the birds as it exists, taking eye swabs, nasal swabs, mouth swabs, cloacal swabs, looking at blood samples, just kind of baseline data so that we'll know if any of these things change in the near future. Otherwise, we'd never know. I mean, if we see some bizarre parasite or organism, is that something new or has it always been there? Is it a problem? So it's really important to kind of get to a population before things start to change. So that's what we're doing. And to date, we've done 4 years now of the health assessment for the penguins. Over 300 birds we've gotten samples from. And in association with some of the projects that our people there are working on, we've tagged a total of 725 birds, and we have again biological samples on over 300 birds. And so we're looking at things like infectious disease, and this year we're actually going to be looking also at environmental contaminants. So with regards to some of those those natural gas plants and the fish meal plants, are we actually seeing any of that toxicology in the blood of the birds? Because we hadn't really been looking at toxicology yet. That's kind of a whole different series of tests that you have to take. And even looking at some gene diversity as well, because we do have some samples from the Chilean population in Milwaukee, and to see, are they very different? Are they similar? Is there a lot of exchange between the two populations? One of the ideas that Dr. Mike Atkinson had was to kind of expand the health assessment to not just the penguins, but also the birds that live with them, which makes a lot of sense, which is the pelicans and the cormorants. So this past year, I think 2 years now, they've gone, where they've actually collected samples from pelicans and the cormorants. And again, that makes perfect sense. These guys are living right next to each other. And then I should mention, I talked about chicken. Remember I talked about how the Peruvian president at the turn of the century introduced chicken to the Peruvian diet? So as you're driving along the Peruvian coast, you see all of these chicken farms. And they put up these huge chicken farms right on the beach, right on the coast, adjacent to the ocean and all the birds that live there. And when they're done with the farms, they just abandon them. So they're left there, and the chickens just kind of defecate on the beach. And when they slaughter the chickens, they walk away, and all that's kind of in the sand and in the soil. And so obviously, there's potential for these chickens to be introducing diseases to a lot of these native birds as well. So this last year, we also tested some chickens as well to see if the local chickens might be carrying anything that they could pass along to the native birds. And Brookfield is particularly interested. They have some interest in marine mammals, in particular fur seals. So they've expanded. Last year, they actually looked at some fur seals as well. There was anticipated El Nino, and they really wanted to get there before the El Nino hit because they anticipated the populations might crash. It actually ended up being a somewhat mild El Nino, so it was all right. But anyway, so they're really interested in that. They'll pursue that. But I'm very happy to announce that on December 20th of this last year, and again, this had a lot to do with sort of, I think, our efforts, our partners' efforts, and particularly Patricia Malouf's efforts to convert all of these 33 guano sites were incorporated into the Peruvian Protected Area System. So as of December of last year, they are now actually national parks. So the focus has, in fact, changed from just protecting the guano to protecting the animals that live there. I don't know what that means to us yet. We're actually going to have a meeting the week after next. Patricia's coming out, various partners are coming out, and we're going to talk about how this will, in fact, impact the penguins that live there. It is a third world country. They don't have a lot of money to sink into their national parks, so I don't think a lot will change initially. Some of the laws may change. It may actually be more difficult for us to work there, we'll see. And unfortunately, their presidents and their regimes change quite a lot, and often very, without any anticipated vote, it just kind of happens. So you have to deal with that too. So when governments change, policies change, et cetera. But this is still a great step in the right direction. So we're really, really happy with that. And I want to really extend thanks particularly to our main partners that help support our staff, because the staff sometimes is sort of not a really glitzy thing to support. Sometimes a tangible thing, a wall, I don't know, a lot of different things. An education project is always very popular with potential donors, but funding staff isn't always that glamorous, and they really have the greatest impact on what's going on there, and they're invaluable. And for these young people to live in this remote space and be so dedicated, it's a beautiful space, mind you. I wouldn't mind waking up there a lot of mornings, not every morning though. I still need my cup of coffee and get a nice meal once in a while, but this is a pretty remote location. But anyway, we're very dedicated to them and thank them for all their support. And I thank you for coming. Now, I think what we're going to do, how much time do we have now? Enough time. So we have like a 6-minute video that we have, and this is sort of a marketing video that we put together. But I wanted you to see the place and not just slides, because it's really a beautiful place, and it's the diversity and the concentrations of animals that exist in this really small place that's spectacular. So without further ado.
Desert coast. The land is barren like a moonscape, yet when it reaches the coast, there's this incredible explosion of life, and that's because of these cold ocean currents coming up from Antarctica, and cold water generally supports a larger diversity of sea life, and because of the sea life we have the sea lions and the penguins and the Inca terns, and but it's the concentration of all those things together in such a small spot that for me is just almost emotionally and mentally overwhelming. But it kind of gives me a high that I can't get in a lot of different places.
Once you step for the first time in San Juan, you just fall madly in love with the place, and 30 years later I'm still there, and although less closely attached to work happening there, but I think what I'm doing now is affecting it in a more long-term way, because you can't just protect the land, you have to make sure that whatever's affecting it outside also is controlled. So.
This is a natural gas exporting plant, so obviously a lot of large tanker ships coming in and out of the area. Potential for spills associated with that. The shanty town that we can kind of see behind us is just kind of association with this plant. So
something like probably hundreds of people that weren't even here just a year or two ago.
Yeah, and with that, the garbage and the pollution that the people bring with them, as well as increased hunting along the coastlines, increased fishing, just can be very damaging to these marine ecosystems. These chicken farms really line most of the coastal regions of the southern part of Peru. One thing that we're concerned about is what diseases these chickens may have or what they may be harboring, and then what risk that poses to a lot of these seabird populations, and specifically the Humboldt penguin.
The penguins have traditionally used guano as a burrowing habitat, and so they nest inside the guano, and this is one of the best habitats for them to breed.
What I'm standing on right now is guano. It looks like soil, but it's actually a lot of bird feces, which is really high in nitrogen, which is a great source of fertilizer.
Be careful that when you do take the guano, whatever you do is done during times when the local wildlife is not affected. You can't just say don't fish, because it's in a poor country like ours, you can't do that.
And there's been some new methods of fishing recently, and they're using dynamite. Just dropping dynamite into the ocean, and everything basically gets blown up that's there, including penguins.
One of our main goals with this project is really to have a very proactive approach to our efforts here. So we're trying to gather this data to prevent any sort of potential future problems.
Animales, quizás podríamos aprender muchas cosas de ellos también, ¿no?
So you can learn a lot. We can all learn a lot from the animals that live, that we share the earth with.
Yeah.
San Juan wouldn't be there if it hadn't been for American zoos. I mean, to have collaboration, to have the world look after such an important place like San Juan makes a lot of sense because it gives it more importance, that it helps us achieve things that we probably wouldn't be able to if it hadn't that extra attention.
I think, whenever you develop a conservation project, particularly when it's not in your own country, and, let's face it, we're coming into Peru providing support for people here because we were asked to. We were invited to come here and help. So ultimately, the greatest success would be us walking away, us saying that these locations are safe, guano is being harvested in an ecologically friendly way, fisheries are being regulated, students are being trained to do the work that we're, flying thousands of miles to do when they can take a short bus ride and do it. So the success would be walking away one day and having this place, be safe and the animals be safe, and have nothing change and it be the way it is now forever.
So I hope that moved you a little bit. It always moves me just a little bit. So I think we have some time for questions, right? So I guess we'll bring up the lights a little bit if there's any questions. Thank you. In the back? Yeah, the question is, do the penguins stay on the land, or they migrate around? Most penguins actually, in fact, spend most of their life in the open ocean. Some of the penguins, particularly the spheniscid penguin, it's a particular genus of penguin, of which the Humboldt is one of 4 species, they actually are more connected to the land. So they routinely come on land even when they're not nesting necessarily. So they're always associated with a certain kind of coastal area. So yeah, they might go out and forage for hours at a time, but then they come back to land and then go out and forage and then come back to land. Now, at certain times, like right after molt, where they drop all their feathers, or right before they drop all their feathers, they might go out to sea for a few months, but then they'll come back and do whatever they need to be doing on land. Other species spend, 8 months out in the open ocean, only coming back onto land to reproduce. Bob, did you have a question?
Actually, that was also, do the other birds that nest there, do they come back and forth, or are they basically
The question is, do the other birds that nest there come back and forth? Yeah, they leave. They leave. So if you were to go there during the non-breeding season, there'd still be some cormorants there, but nowhere near the numbers. So they probably kind of follow the fish stocks. So as, maybe if certain species might be breeding further south, so they'll go further south. But the penguins do pretty much stay there and utilize just, maybe 1 or 2 fish stocks. Anything else? Up over here? The question is, do the penguins sleep when they're out in the ocean? No. I wouldn't either, not with all those predators. No, and birds are a little different in that they don't have sleep the way we have sleep. They have really periods of sort of activity and inactivity. So when they're out in the ocean, for the most part, though, they're foraging. So they're actively fishing. Yep. There's a question in the back. The question is, the United States the only country that's helping out? No. I mean, with regards to Punta San Juan, I'm pretty aware of the other countries that are helping, and through our center, we have had zoos from Amsterdam and a couple British zoos that have helped in that one location. But, in other areas of Peru, there might be people doing other things, but of course, I know the most about PSJ, Punta San Juan, and it's mostly Americans with, again, a couple of British institutions and one Dutch institution has helped. Anything else? All right, well, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed it.